We are coming to the end of our CRB at the Movies series. Have you had a good time, my friends? Have you had a good time? Good. The four of you. It's great. It's great. We'll see. We'll do it again next summer. Who knows what we'll do. That film is, of course, what? Wrong. That was City Slickers. That was City Slickers, the Billy Crystal comedic classic. Sorry, these jokes, man, as the day goes on, I'm telling you, these jokes just, they go off the rails. Yeah, of course, that is Star Wars Rogue One. You have no idea how intimidating it is to talk about Star Wars, because like the moment the message is over, like 4 Star Wars experts will find me on the edge of the stage and give me a theological critique of what Darth Vader actually meant. And I'm telling you, I've seen him, but I am not by any stretch of the imagination a Star Wars, guru. I went as Darth Vader one year for Halloween. That's about the extent of my knowledge. It was a black cowboy hat with a black anyway, it was good. You can try it this year. But I want to spend a few moments today talking about my worst fear in life. And I'm serious about this. I want to talk about my worst fear. And I even thought about starting the message today by having you turn to the person next to you and tell them your worst fear. Then I realized for some of you, your worst fear is telling a stranger your worst fear. So I decided not to do that. But my worst fear is that a faith that I'm really passionate about at this moment, this stage of my life, a faith that over the last 20 or so years, I could point to over and over again. Rosanna and I both, we could point to so many moments of just going, that was an only God moment. That was an only God moment. That's an only God moment. Where I've just seen the activity of God over and over again. One of my biggest fear in life, it's not death, it's not public speaking. My biggest fear is that one day my faith that I'm really passionate about at this moment in this stage of life would just go out like a winter fire. That's my greatest fear. That one day I would wake up, that it wouldn't just be, sort of all at once, but it would just over a period of time, that I would wake up in 10 years or 20 years or 40 years, and a faith that at this moment, this age, this stage of life is like a raging fire at times that just drives me to my knees time and time again, that my faith would just get snuffed out, get stomped out. And it's my greatest fear, and here's the reason why. And I know we're not supposed to live lives of fear, but fear can be a good thing. It can cause us to put boundaries in place. And part of the reason it's my biggest fear is because I have seen it happen to people time and time again, and I imagine you have too. It's somebody who used to sit on your row at church. It's somebody who used to be in your small group, and they didn't find another church, did they? It's somebody you raised kids with, and at some moment in their life, their faith was central, it was important, it was critical to them. But somewhere along the way, they just sort of walked away. They just sort of wandered away from faith, and they couldn't even really pinpoint how or when or why. It wasn't sort of like one big moment. It just sort of slowly over time, they just drifted away from God. I have seen it happen to family. I have seen it happen to friends. I have seen it happen time and time again. And it's my greatest fear. A couple of years ago, actually it was about 20 or so years ago, there was a mentor of mine. He was played a huge role in my faith as an early Christian. And he was just a critical reason why I came to faith in the first place. And he was just sort of like one of those guys that when he would pray, you would want to take notes while he prayed, and his prayers were even so deep. You know what I'm talking about? And I ran into him a couple years ago. It had been 15 or 16 years. And as I was talking about faith and God and life, and he was asking me what I did for a living, I was like, I'm a pastor, man. I'm like a professional Christian, And in those early stages of faith, I'm telling you, he was like this raging inferno. And I was kind of like this little pilot light trying to get a spark going of faith. And he was just so critical in my faith development. And as we were talking, he said, I got to be honest with you, I have not been to church in years. And it wasn't, he didn't come out and say, well, I'm an atheist now, but it was just sort of this, his faith, it just was not central. It was not critical to him at this moment in his life. And it's my greatest fear. And I think it's a healthy fear because it causes us to pay attention. It causes us to sort of pay attention to our faith and make sure that we're not drifting away. The writers of the scriptures warn us that this is possible, that the natural gravitational pull of your faith and the natural gravitational pull of my faith is to move away from God, not to get closer. That's sort of the pull of life for all of us. And the writer of Hebrews says it this way. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1 says, we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not, and what's the word, drift away. We must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. You got to pay attention. That if you have that fear in your life, that at some moment you've seen that in somebody else's life, he says you got to pay attention. In fact, on the count of 3, let's all say pay attention together. 1, 2, 3. Pay attention so that you do not drift away, because that will be the natural pull of faith, that you will drift away unless you pay attention. Have you ever noticed that when you get into the ocean, where you get into the ocean is never where you get out of the ocean? A couple of days ago, Dane, my 6-year-old, and I, we were down at Moonlight Beach along with the rest of the state of California. It's a nice perk to the heat wave, isn't it? The ocean's amazing right now. And we're down at the beach, and I was teaching him how to body surf. And while we were out in the waves, and he was having like this amazing time, we get in the ocean. And as we were in the waves, as we were in the ocean, every time we would look up, I mean, you had that moment. You've had that moment before where you're like, wait a second, we got in at Moonlight Beach. We got out, and it's like Indonesia. Like, how do we get out here? Like, what is going on? And it's just the slow, steady drift of the ocean. And so finally, I took a bunch of towels and some sand buckets that we had brought, and I put them on the beach. And I said, Dane, we got to make sure we pay attention to those, to our possessions, so that we know as we sort of drift away, we don't get too far away. And Paul, or the writers of the scriptures, say the same thing is true, that you have to pay attention, because you, just like the ocean, you will drift and drift away and go, wait a second, how in the world did I get here? And in my experience, when people drift away from God, it's not because of a theological reason. When people drift away from God, it's not because of a moral failure, although those things certainly happen. In my experience, when people drift away from God, if you could pinpoint it, if you could put an exact reason on it, the reason people drift away from God is because at some moment in their faith journey, they just get tired and weary of being good. That's the reason. For many of us, maybe you find yourself there today. You're just sort of tired. You're exhausted from being a good person, from trying to be a Christian. And there's something in you that goes, is there any benefit to all this? You sort of look around, maybe it's in terms of your finances, and you've tried to honor God with your money. You've tried to, give money to charitable causes or to the church, and you've asked God, hey, will you bless our finances? You've tried to do your best, but then you look around at people who ignore God, and they seem to be blessed far more than you, and there's something in you that goes, well, that doesn't make sense, and you find you're just exhausted, just weary from being a good person. Maybe it's in terms of your marriage. You sort of hit the rocks, and you're 10 years in, you're 2 years in, you're 20 years in, and you're hanging on, you're trying, and there's something in you going, you know what, we're going to try to honor God in our marriage, and we're going to try to, sort of work this thing out, and you're just tired, you're exhausted, you're going, God, are you ever going to, fix him? Are you ever going to fix her? Are you going to, fix me in the middle of this? And you've seen friends walk away for way less reasons, and there's something in you that's just getting weary and tired of holding on, and you just kind of wonder, is God going to leverage his godness? Is he going to leverage his power to do something to bring strength in the middle of this situation? I think for me, where I sort of feel that weariness, that exhaustion over and over again, is when I look at people that are in their 80s or 90s and they've ignored God their entire life and they still have a charmed existence. You ever see that before? It's annoying, isn't it? They've been selfish their whole life. They've never cared about anybody. And they just, it's like everything works out great for them. And then you'll see people in their 40s, 50s, 60s who have loved God, done what they're supposed to do, and cancer or something hits, and you're going, God, that just doesn't seem fair. And in those particular moments, when you start to have those thoughts, you become a candidate, and I become a candidate to drift away from God. When you start going, God, I am tired and exhausted from being good and doing what I think I'm supposed to do, and I need you to leverage some of your God-like powers on my behalf, and it doesn't seem like you're doing that very well, that's when you become a candidate, and that's when I become a candidate to begin to drift away from God. And the good news is that the scriptures speak to people who are weary. The scriptures speak in the book of Isaiah. The voice of God comes to a weary people in Judah, in the nation of Israel. If you have a Bible, you can turn with me to Isaiah chapter 40. God is going to bring hope, not through Princess Leia, but through Prince Isaiah, sort of the parallel there. God brings this voice. It's sort of the same moment. You see the chaos. You see the scene 2,700 years ago in Judah. This sort of, is God going to do something? What's going to happen? And what Isaiah comes to bring to the people in this moment is hope. To a weary and tired people, Isaiah speaks like Princess Leia, going, "Yeah, he's given us hope. He's rising hope in our midst." Isaiah chapter 40, let me give you a little backdrop on this particular story. The nation of Israel, when they become a nation, or when they're done wandering in the wilderness, they form a nation in the place where they are to this very day in Israel, and they're just a big blot of land, essentially. That's all they have. They have a big blot of land, and they don't really have an established system of governance. They're just sort of a nomadic people trying to organize themselves. And they start to look around at other nations and they go, wait, they have a king, God, we want a king. And so God gives Israel a king. The first king of Israel is a guy named, anybody know, King? Very good, King Saul. King Saul is the first king. He is a wicked king. Things derail for Saul very, very quickly. The next king of Israel is a guy named King David. Yeah, very good. David, he has some ups and downs, doesn't he? But for the most part, David is a pretty good king. We name babies David because he was a good guy. The third king of Israel is a guy named King. Yes, very good, man. This is the what? All the Cove kids? Nice. This is Strauss groupies, man. I love it, yeah. Mark, I'm sure you're watching online right now, but let me just tell you, you've got some fans here. They're taking notes in Hebrew, which is really impressive, so. Oh, I'm sorry, it's Greek. I'm sorry, I didn't run. Yeah, okay, so we got it. 3 people, no. Yes, the third king of Israel is Solomon. Well, after that, that's kind of where things get a little fuzzy and a little weird, even if you go to the Cove every week. The civil war breaks out in Israel. Now, I know you know this, but play along like you don't. Civil war breaks out, and they divide into 2 separate territories. They divide into the northern kingdom and the... See, you don't even need to go to the Cove and know this stuff, huh? Just kidding. You need to go to the Cove. I'm telling you, it's incredible. Dr. Mark Strauss is amazing. So anyway, moving on. They divide into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom is often referred to as Judah. This gives a little context for the story. Now, in the northern kingdom, this is about 2,700 years ago or so, they go off the rails. They have a bunch of terrible, wicked kings. They essentially begin to live as a pagan nation, ignoring everything from the commandments, everything God has told them to do. In the southern kingdom, in Judah, they have some good kings and they have some bad kings, some good kings and some bad kings. But for the most part, the people in Judah, the people of the southern kingdom, they're faithful to God and they do what they're supposed to do. Well, the story, this is around the year 735 BC or so. Essentially what happens, so 735 years before Jesus, essentially what happens is Assyria, with a capital A, is the world's superpower. They're kind of like the Roman Empire of the Old Testament. They are terrible to other nations. They do stuff that we couldn't even repeat in church. And the northern kingdom is tired of Assyria. The northern kingdom, you know, they're not a good nation either, but they're going, man, we are so tired of the Assyrians. So they go, the king of the northern kingdom goes to a nation called Aram and says, let's make a military pact against the nation of Assyria. And so they said, well, that's a great idea. Let's do that. And they're trying to recruit some other nations to kind of join this alliance. And so they go to the southern kingdom. And the king of the southern kingdom at this time is a guy named Ahaz. On the count of 3, let's say Ahaz. 1, 2, 3. Ahaz, we're all sort of playing along together. Ahaz, if you're pregnant and you need a good baby name, may I offer Ahaz? It's a good one. Just kidding, he was a terrible, wicked king. He's not a good idea. There's a reason we don't name babies Ahaz. Ahaz is about 20 years old at this time. He's a wicked king. In fact, he's such a wicked king that when he died, they took his body outside of Judah because they said he's not even worthy to be buried in the nation that he used to rule. He was such a wicked, terrible king. Now, the northern kingdom goes to Ahaz And they said, hey, look, we're going to go to war against Assyria. Why don't you join us in this alliance? Now, Ahaz, he's a bad king, but he's not a stupid king. And he knows that to go to war against Assyria is to sign his death warrant. They're too powerful. And he also knows the other problem is that if he says no to this military alliance to go against the northern kingdom, or to go against Assyria, if he says no, the northern kingdom and Aram are just gonna turn their forces against him in the southern kingdom, and he's sort of doomed either way, and he doesn't know what to do. Now, typically in Judah, a king would go before the prophets, go before God, say, hey, we need some help. We need God to, sort of leverage his power to do something. But because Ahaz is so wicked and he's been so disobedient, he knows that he cannot do that. And the people of Judah find out that they are in this terrible situation, that because of their terrible king, it's sort of war one way or the other, and it's destruction one way or the other. And they're mad and they're angry, and in the middle of this crisis and all sorts of the chaos that's going on, God is going to send a prophet to the people of Judah, and his name is Isaiah, and he brings a word of comfort to a weary and an exhausted people who are ready to unhitch from the God thing, because after all, if God was really God, he would have shown up and leveraged his power to do something in the middle of this situation. And it doesn't look like he's gonna do that. And they're exhausted and they're weary. And there's a promise at the end of this that is a promise for the people of Judah 2,700 years ago, and it's a promise for you, and it's a promise for me. This is what the prophet Isaiah says in the midst of this crisis. He says, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for, and that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. So Isaiah comes to the people and says, hey, look, God is not punishing you for anything. God's not angry with you. Which I don't know about you, but I know for me, when circumstances begin to unravel in my life, there is something in me in those moments that say, God, are you punishing me for something? How many of us know that feeling? How many of us have said that before in a prayer? God, are you punishing me? Like, is this about spring break 1994? Like all these years later, kind of getting me back for, like, what did I do? And there's just, you like that? There's just something in us in crisis. There's something in us in moments of frustration where we're going, I don't get it, God. Like, did I make you mad? Like, is this some kind of retaliation? And he's going, Judah, no, that's not how God plays the game. You're not being punished for something. I'm not angry at you. And the same is true for you. The same is true for me. When you look at your circumstances and you can't make sense of them, it's not that God is punishing you for something. He's up to something. You just can't see it. And it gets to that in the very next verse. It says, a voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be raised up, every mountain and hill made low. The rough ground shall become level, and the rugged places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will be, what's the word? Revealed. And all people will what? Will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. He's going, Judah, you can't see it right now, but I'm up to something. You and I, we get fixated on Assyria. And there's something in you and me in moments of crisis, moments of anxiety, moments where we're looking at our circumstances of finances, of family, of health, of job, of whatever it may be in our circumstances. And there's something in you and there's something in me that says, I cannot see a sign of God's faithfulness. Therefore, God is not faithful. And when those thoughts begin to creep in, you and I in those moments, just like Judah, we become a candidate to walk away and drift away from God. And some of us, if you're really honest, sort of where you're at with God right now is this prayer or this moment of going, God, I do not see a sign of your activity, therefore you are not active. I do not see any God power being leveraged on my behalf. Therefore, you are not God. And he's going, hang on, Judah. Hang on, Jared. Just because you don't see a sign of my activity doesn't mean I'm not active. Just because you cannot see a sign of my faithfulness right now doesn't mean that I'm not faithful. And you and I, we start looking at God through little snapshots, and we'll freeze the frame on the last 2 months or the last 2 years of our life going, I have not seen God leverage his power in this window of time. And he's going, huh? Judah, are you kidding me? I have been faithful to you in your past, and I'm going to be faithful to you again in your future. And just because you cannot see my activity now does not mean that I'm not active. But you got to hang on. And you got to open your eyes, and you got to start to look beyond the Assyria that you're staring at. And you got to start to look to who God is. And he asks a series of questions. I love this, verse 12. Who has measured the water in the hollow of his hand, or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales, and the hills in a balance? And you see this time and time again. When people in the scriptures lose perspective, God says, let me give you some perspective again. When people in the scriptures aren't sure what to do, God says, let me give you a wider view. Let me help you see this through a fisheye lens, because you are so focused on the little moment that you're in. And he says, you need to step back. Who can fathom the Spirit of the Lord or instruct the Lord as his counselor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him, and who taught him the right way? Who was it that taught him knowledge or showed him the path of understanding? Who among us has ever given advice to God? Anybody? When in history has God ever found himself in a bind going, I wonder what Jared would do about this? He never once. I don't know why. I thought God and I are close. He's never asked my opinion. He's never asked my advice. He's not walking around heaven today with a WWJD, what would Jared do bracelet, you know? He's on his throne and he's fine. And I start looking at Assyria. I start looking at all the circumstances, and God, are you gonna, and when are you gonna? And God's on his throne, and all the things that rattle you and all the things that rattle me. He is not rattled today by an overheated housing market. He is not nervous about a 2020 presidential election. He is on his throne and he's fine. And he's going, doesn't matter what happens, I'm God. And I'm gonna be on my throne one way or the other. And I know you're looking at Assyria, but I want you to look beyond Assyria to the source of everything, the giver of all things. I'm God, Judah. And I know you're staring at this, but in the middle of this, I want you to look up and stare at me. I'm God, and everything's gonna be okay. And he says this to the people. I love some of these verses, some of those powerful verses I've ever read. He says, who can fathom the Spirit of the Lord or instruct him as his counselor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him? Who was taught the right way? Who was it that taught him knowledge or showed him the path of understanding? And then he says this in verse 15, surely the nations are like a drop in a bucket. They are regarded as dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Anybody been to Hawaii lately? I mean, I just love that. He says, to you, that's a vacation. To me, that's a speck of dust in the grand scheme of things. Lebanon is not sufficient for altar fires, nor its animals enough for burnt offerings. Before him, all the nations are as nothing. They are regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing. And he's essentially in this moment, he's going, Judah, come on. Jared, come on. We all have this tendency to make decisions about God's faithfulness and God's permanence based on our temporary circumstances. And he says, whoa, don't make that mistake. Don't make the mistake of looking at your temporary circumstances and making decisions about the eternal faithfulness and permanence of your God. Because your tendency and mine is to look at our circumstances, and I understand why. I do the exact same thing. And we're going, God, in the last 2 months, in the last 90 days, in the last 8 years, you have not leveraged your power to defeat Assyria in terms of my family, in terms of health, in terms of this moment, in terms of a job situation, in terms of the promotion. You have not done what I thought you should do. Therefore, you must not be God. And he's going, don't make that mistake, Judah. Don't make that mistake, Jared. Don't make that trade. Don't trade in the faith of what you know to be true because you don't see evidence of me in this circumstance. And your lack of peace with your circumstances, it's not evidence that God's not God. Your lack of peace with your circumstances is just evidence that you're not God. And you can't control your circumstances. He's going, Judah, come on. Don't look at your circumstances and go, I don't see you right now. And then make the fatal leap to decide that I don't exist. And you just walk away from your faith like they did in the northern kingdom. Hang on, Judah. Hang on, Jared. Don't make decisions about the eternal faithfulness of God based on 90 days or a few years of life. I'm God, for crying out loud. And I am not rattled today by what's rattling you, and I want you to look beyond Assyria. And he says this in some of the most just beautiful lyrical statements in the scriptures. Verse 22 of Isaiah 40, he says, he sits enthroned, talking about himself. He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth. I love that. I always wondered, why in the world did they think the earth was flat for all those years, man? Right there, right in the heart of the scriptures. If Christopher Columbus would have just read the Bible, I'm telling you, it would have saved him a lot of trouble. He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth. Its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. He brings princes to naught and reduces the ruler of the world, of this world, to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground that he blows on them and they wither, and a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. You want to talk to me about Assyria, Judah? Come on. I'm God. To whom will you compare me? Or who is my equal? Says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. And you have this tendency, and I have the same tendency, and he's going, Judah, I know what you're doing. You're looking at Assyria. You're looking at your circumstances. And I need you to step back from looking at your circumstances. And if you're in a moment of crisis of faith and you're about to unhinge and walk away, stop looking at your circumstances and go out tonight and look at the stars. And you just go out and look up. And instead of looking at the lack of God's faithfulness in the last 2 months, go out and look at God's faithfulness throughout all of eternity that is present throughout every single night. I have hung Jupiter, I have hung Mars, I have hung every galaxy. I have been faithful to hang the moon every single night. I am eternal and faithful. Instead of staring at your circumstances, Judah, instead of staring at your circumstances, Jared, just go look at the stars for a little while. And it'll put the whole thing in perspective really, really fast. And it doesn't mean that Assyria is not real. It just means that in those moments of crisis and those moments where you want to walk away, let me ask you a question, Judah. Let me ask you a question, Jared. Are you going to walk away from the God who made all of that because you're frustrated about that? Don't make that trade. Don't make that trade. It says, Judah, come on. I know you're frustrated. I know you're scared. I know you don't know what's going to happen next, but let me show you something. I'm God, and like a sweeping canvas across the sky, I remind you every night that I'm God, and let it be a constant reminder to you that I'm bigger than Assyria or anything you're up against today. And if you just hang on, although you do not see a sign of my faithfulness right now, if you look up, you will be reminded that I'm faithful throughout all of history, and I'm going to be faithful to you in the present and in the future. Don't make that trade. Don't walk away from the God who made all of that because you're frustrated about that. He says, come on, Judah. Come on, Jared. And he continues, and he asks more questions. That's sort of his nature as God. I love that. He says, why do you complain, Jacob? Why do you say, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, my cause is disregarded by my God? Anybody feel that way today? My cause is disregarded by God. I don't get it, God. I've been single for 44 years. Why, like, God, at any moment you want to bring me the right husband, that would be fantastic, God, if you could do that. If you want to bring Brad Pitt and Billy Graham kind of rolled into one person, that would be, I'd really appreciate that. God, if I've been out of work for a while. If you could, at any moment, God, if you could leverage some of your God-like power, if you could make the stars, can you get that recruiter to call me back? Could you do something? And is my cause disregarded by God? Every single one of us in this room, even if you're not a Christian, you have felt that way when you've pulled for the Chargers, man. It's every one of us. You have felt that at some moment. Is my cause disregarded by God? What in the world? And he says, let me give you some perspective. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. God does not need rest. He's not tired of being God. You maybe are at the end of your sanity from being a mom. You might be at the edge of your sanity at your job. You might be at the edge of, I can't do this anymore in your line of work, whatever it is. And he is not exhausted. He is not tired of being God. He's the everlasting God, still on his throne. And he says this in verse 29, and here's the promise. And this was true 2,700 years ago, and this is just as true today. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. When you find yourself in a moment of exhaustion, when you find yourself in a moment where all the Starship Troopers are running in and you don't know what to do, and you feel like that moment of, I don't know how to continue here, I don't know what to do. When you find yourself, you're weary, you're tired, you're beaten down, you're looking at your finances, you're looking at your circumstances, you're looking at life, and you're going, I don't get it. He says, here's my promise to you. I'm not going to promise you that I'm going to wield the sword against Assyria, but here's what I promise. I promise I will give strength to the weary and increase the power of the weak. That's God's promise to you today. And that's God's promise to me today. And how often, if you're anything like me, do we get frustrated at God for something that he never promised us? I mean, if you're honest with yourself, if I'm honest with myself, most of the time that I'm angry at God or I'm looking at circumstances going, are you kidding me? I'm mad over something he never promised. He never promised health. He never promised financial stability. He never promised the promotion. He never promised you whatever it is that you're upset. He didn't promise you that. But what he has promised you is when you are at the edge of your sanity, he will meet you in that place, the everlasting God, and he will give you strength and he will increase the power of the weak. That's his promise to you in those moments. If you're going to hold God accountable for something, hold him accountable for that. That's the promise that he's given to you. When you can't, he says, I can. And I will meet you in those moments, and this is what I will do. This is my promise. I give strength to the weary, and I increase the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord, and there's the word. Here comes Prince Isaiah with the correspondence. Those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. And the word for hope there in the Hebrew language is this idea of not some kind of, mental place that you need to go. Well, I need to hope, and you should have hope, and hope's a good thing. The idea of hope for a follower of Christ, the idea of hope for the people of God, the way the word is translated, it essentially means that we would lean into God, that we would, in the same way a robber would wait in the wilderness or wait in the woods for somebody to come so they can, do something wrong. It says in the same way, that's the kind of hope I'm talking about. I want you to wait with a sense of expectation that God's going to do something. I want you to lean in with a sense that God's not finished. I want you to lean in. I want you to hope in the Lord. I want you to wait on the Lord with a sense of leaning in. And wait on the Lord is not in the sense of, well, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to just, get mad at God until he does something. No, I want you to wait in the same way a waiter waits on tables and is constantly active doing something. I want you to lean in with a sense of expectation that I'm God. I want you to lurch. I want you to lean in my direction. That's what I want you to do. That's how hope works. And begin to pray with a sense of expectation. Pray with a sense of we don't know when, we don't know how, but we know the God who's been faithful through all of history is going to be faithful in our midst and in our day, and we don't even understand why or when or how it's all going to work. But we're hoping, and we're leaning, and we're lurching, and we know that's who God is. And he says, if you do that, I increase your strength. I will renew their strength. and they will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. I want you to live with that sense of expectation. Anybody weary today? Anybody a candidate to drift away? Anybody just exhausted, wondering why God hasn't leveraged his power and authority to defeat something in your life? He says, you're a candidate to have your strength increased. You're a candidate, if you hope in me, to be renewed and to experience something divine that you've never experienced before. I will do that. That's my promise to you as God. And I've seen it 100 times with many of you in this room. I've seen it time and time again in my own life. And here's how you begin to experience it. To the degree that you lean into Jesus when you are tired is the degree that you become comforted in those moments. To the degree that you find yourself leaning into Jesus when you can't continue and move forward, in those moments, to the degree that you lean into Jesus, that's the degree where you begin to have some divine story of God renewed my strength. God showed up. God increased my power when I was at my weakest. I've seen it happen time and time again. I saw this modeled for me when I was a kid. My mom, 20 years of marriage ended. I was a high school kid, left with tons of debt. And I remember as a high school kid, every single day for years, walking up to my room, and I'd walk past my mom's room, and there was my mom on the edge of her bed with her Bible out, and she's just reading the scriptures, and oftentimes the pages of her scriptures just soaked in tears. And you would ask, Mom, why are you still holding on? Why are you still going to church? Why are you still clinging to this God when there is no sign of his faithfulness? And her response over and over again, to the degree that we lean into Jesus is the degree that we will be comforted in these days. And when you find yourself in that place, when you find tears hitting the pages of the scriptures, when you've become a candidate to unhinge and walk away because it's been going on for months or years, and you don't know what to do, you have become a candidate to experience one of God's greatest miracles in this world. Your strength renewed, power given away to you in those moments. And he maybe isn't going to wield the sword in the way that you want, but he is going to use his power to give you power when you lean in and you hope in God. Paul says it this way to the church in Galatia. He says, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. I know somebody within the sound of my voice is wanting to give up. Somebody's tired, weak. There is not a sign of God's faithfulness, and there hasn't been for a while. And you're wondering, is he even faithful? You're tired of hearing good stories in other people's lives and wondering, when's the good story coming my way? When is something going to happen? And he says, something good will happen in this place, even with no change in the circumstance. I am going to increase your strength, and you're going to experience something nobody else has experienced in your life, because you're going to be met by the creator of heaven and earth, and you're going to be given a gift of strength and power, because that's my promise to you in these moments. Do not become weary in doing good. Hang on, hang on. I'm the God who meets you there. Let's pray together. Jesus Christ, you meet us in our weakness. You meet us in our moment of wanting to let go. And so many of us, myself included, have had moments or seasons where we walk away going, if he was really God, the last 6 months wouldn't have looked like that. If he was really God, this whole thing would have gotten rerouted. If he was really God, I would have seen. And your message to us in those moments is the same message that it was 2,700 years ago. You will reveal, we will see. But in these moments of our weakest, these moments of not wanting to continue, you give strength. You renew our strength. Would you do that today, Father? It's in Jesus' name that we pray. And all of God's children said, grace and peace.